Hello, everyone, and welcome back. Today, we are talking about an all too common scenario when your SIBO test says it's negative, but your symptoms say otherwise. And if you've had a SIBO test come back negative, but your symptoms haven't gone anywhere, you're not crazy. This is something I see all the time. People go through the process, they get the test, which is not a simple test. They wait for the results and then get told everything looks normal. Meanwhile, they're still dealing with bloating, discomfort, constipation or diarrhea, food reactions, and a gut that just does not feel right. So they're left wondering, if my test was normal, why do I still feel like I have SIBO? The truth is, SIBO breath tests are not as straightforward as they seem. In many cases, the issue is not the test itself, it's how the results are interpreted. When interpretation is too rigid or overly reliant on summary boxes or cutoffs, it can miss what the full pattern is actually showing. That doesn't mean the test is useless. In fact, when it's interpreted properly, it can be one of the most insightful and game-changing tools for someone who's been struggling with IBS type symptoms for a long time. It just means you have to know what you're looking at. In today's episode, I am going to walk you through the most common ways that SIBO breath tests can come back negative, even when something is clearly going on, and how to actually make sense of your results so you're not left guessing. So let's first talk about why the type of sugar used in your SIBO test matters. And before we get too far into that, let's kind of ground ourselves and understand basically what the SIBO breath test is actually measuring. So, after a period of fasting, you drink a sugar solution. And if there are microbes in the small intestine, they ferment that sugar as it passes through your intestines and they produce gases like hydrogen or methane or even hydrogen sulfide. We measure those gas levels over a 2 to 3 hour period to get a sense of where fermentation is happening along the digestive tract. One of the most overlooked reasons for a false negative SIBO test is simply the type of test that was used. Most breath tests for SIBO use either glucose or lactulose as the substrate, and those two sugars behave very differently in the body. Glucose is absorbed fairly quickly in the upper part of the small intestine, which means it's primarily reflecting what's happening in the early portion of the small intestine. So, if overgrowth is sitting further down, the glucose never reaches it and the test comes back negative even when something is clearly going on. Lactulose works differently. It is not absorbed well, so it travels through the entire small intestine and even into the large intestine. That allows us to see fermentation patterns along the full length of the digestive tract, giving a more complete picture of what's happening further along in the small intestine and even in the large intestine. This becomes especially important when we are talking about methane dominant overgrowth, or now we call it EMO or intestinal methanogen overgrowth, because methane activity often is not limited to the very beginning of the small intestine and can extend further along the tract, sometimes even into the large intestine. And when that's the case, a glucose based test is much more likely to miss it. So, glucose can miss methane that's further along in the intestine. An easy way to think about this is like checking only the front half of a tunnel and assuming nothing is happening further down. Just because you don't see anything in the entrance doesn't mean there's not activity deeper inside. This doesn't mean one test is always better than the other test, but it does mean that they can give you very different information depending on where overgrowth is happening. One client I worked with, we'll call her Kelly, came in dealing with pretty classic methane type symptoms. She had significant bloating that got worse as the day went on, ongoing constipation, and a level of brain fog that was really starting to affect her day to day. She told me she had already been tested for SIBO, but it came back negative, which left her feeling really stuck and honestly pretty frustrated. She felt like SIBO still made sense for what she was experiencing, but she just didn't know where to go from here. It felt like a dead end. And as I always do, I asked to see the actual test results myself. It took a bit of back and forth with her doctor's office, but she eventually got a copy for me. And when I reviewed it, I saw that it was negative and that glucose had been used as a substrate. I explained to her that glucose can catch a lot of cases, especially when the overgrowth is happening earlier in the small intestine, but it can miss methane when it's occurring further along in the digestive tract. And with what we now understand about intestinal methanogen overgrowth, or EMO, that's not uncommon. Since it had been a few months anyway, we decided to do a retest using lactulose to get a more complete picture. And sure enough, her follow-up test showed a clear methane overgrowth that was not visible on the original test, appearing later in the timeline in the third hour, exactly where a glucose test would not have picked it up. From there, we were able to move forward with a targeted plan. And as we worked through addressing the overgrowth, her bloating improved, her brain fog lifted, and for the first time in a long time, she was able to have regular bowel movements without relying on Miralax. We were able to reintroduce foods without her reacting to everything and put together a plan to help prevent things from coming back. So in this image, you'll see the methane showing up later in the timeline, something a glucose test would not have captured. We have the hydrogen and methane levels pretty low, below 5 in the first 2 hours. And then we do see methane come up to 7 and 8 in the two readings in the third hour. We're going to talk a little bit more about those particular numbers later, but that was lining up with her symptoms. Now, let's talk about just the fact that there are breath tests that are easy to interpret. So I'm not trying to say that SIBO tests are not sometimes just a slam dunk. So there are breath tests that meet the criteria, they get flagged by the lab, and they give us a positive result. So let's talk about what that looks like. Now, we do see a lot of variance across the board. Not everything is a classic presentation, but I'll tell you what a classic presentation looks like. We would see a clear spike in hydrogen. We call it a double peak. It's a pattern where gas rises quickly in the small intestine. It may come down a tad as the solution enters the large intestine, and then we see another second peak as the solution is going through the large intestine, and that second peak represents normal large intestine fermentation because we have lots of good bacteria normally in the large intestine. So in this graph we're looking at, the line for hydrogen rises early, it dips, then it rises again later. And that second rise is again your large intestine. And this is one of the most straightforward presentations of hydrogen dominant SIBO. We can also see another classic presentation is where we see methane that's elevated across the entire test. Now, there are exceptions. We can definitely see hydrogen that starts out high and stays sustained, but typically, again, the classic presentation is more of a double peak or more of a later rise. And then methane, well, we can often see it elevated at baseline and then elevated across the test, steady, consistent, often well above normal without much fluctuation. So I call this a high and sustained presentation. And in this graph we're looking at, this is a classic constipation pattern. Methane stays elevated the entire time, which tells us it's continuously slowing motility. These are what I think of as slam dunk positives. They check every box, they match textbook criteria, they meet the lab's criteria, and they're almost always flagged correctly by the lab. But many real world tests don't look like that. They're not clean, they're not obvious, and they don't always follow the exact pattern the lab is programmed to detect. Instead, they fall into a gray area where something is clearly off and not even borderline. And you guys are going to see what I mean. So, by gray area, I don't even mean like it's borderline, there's room, but gray area where something is definitely off, just not in a way that the lab is picking it up because of their very specific rules and criteria. And that's where patients get missed. I had a client, Megan, who came to me after being told her test was completely normal. She had daily bloating, chronic constipation, felt like food would just sat in her system all day. And when we reviewed her test together, nothing technically spiked high enough to meet the lab's cutoff. Her methane just sat at 6 to 8 parts per million the entire time, which is below the lab's threshold, but absolutely high enough to slow motility and explain her symptoms. And that's the difference between lab interpretation and clinical interpretation. The lab is asking whether the test meets criteria, while I'm asking whether the pattern actually explains what the patient is experiencing. And a lot of time, those are not the same question. So while it's helpful to recognize what a textbook positive looks like, it's even more important to understand that many legitimate cases don't present that way. That's what we're going to walk through next. The patterns that get missed, misread, or dismissed, even when they're clinically meaningful. Rigid interpretation rules miss real patterns. This is where things start to break down because the issue usually is not the test itself or that it's not accurate or that it's a bad test. It's how the test is being interpreted. Most labs rely on strict cutoffs and simple rules, which can work well for obvious cases but fall short when patterns are more nuanced. And in real life, they usually are. So, hydrogen rules. The problem with the 20 parts per million cutoff. So, that is the standard rule for hydrogen based on the North American consensus, is that a rise of at least 20 parts per million within a 90-minute period is considered positive for SIBO. If that doesn't happen, the test is labeled negative. The problem is that this rule assumes you're starting from a low baseline. It also assumes the solution moves through the small intestine within a clean 90-minute window, which is not always the case. In reality, transit time can be slower, sometimes closer to 120 minutes, or even longer if you have severe motility slowing. So that's especially true with people dealing with constipation or motility issues. So if gas rises later, it may still be coming from the small intestine, but it gets dismissed because it falls outside of the 90-minute cutoff. Also, if someone starts out already elevated, they may never reach that 20 parts per million rise, even if levels are high throughout. So, an elevated baseline hydrogen can completely mask a positive. And that's one of the clearest examples of this problem. If hydrogen starts out high, the test may never meet the formal criteria, even when the pattern is clearly abnormal. It's not uncommon to see hydrogen start elevated and stay elevated throughout the test, yet the report still labels it as normal because there wasn't a significant rise from baseline. In more extreme cases, I've seen baselines in the 80 to 100 parts per million range get labeled normal for that exact same reason. I have an example of that from one of my patient results here. So take a look at this test result from one of my patients for a second. Does anything look off to you? Look at the box at the top and find the observed hydrogen value. It's 100 parts per million. Then look to the right of it. It's marked normal. And I want you to tell me, in what world does 100 parts per million sound normal? This is exactly how these rules can fail. In this graph, if you look at the actual data in the results box at the bottom, because her baseline hydrogen started at 81.16 parts per million, and the criteria requires a 20 parts per million rise above baseline for it to be positive, her level would have had to have reached over 101.16 parts per million to be flagged as a positive. And since it didn't, it only got up to 100, the lab just marked it as a negative, despite her hydrogen being extremely elevated the entire time. And clinically, this is nowhere near normal. This was a client of mine, we'll call her Kathy, and she was struggling. She had severe diarrhea that kept her at home, interfering with her ability to travel, spend time with her grandkids, and honestly, just enjoy her retirement. She was losing weight, she was becoming depleted, and her quality of life had taken a major hit. And yet, she was told her test was normal. Kathy was Italian, and one of the things she shared with me early on was how much she missed cooking with garlic and onion and big family meals. She couldn't eat all of the things she had always loved. Ricotta cheese, Italian food had become something she feared instead of something like she had always enjoyed. Once we addressed what was actually going on with her, everything started to change for the better. Her symptoms improved, her digestion stabilized, and she was able to start expanding her diet again. She got back to eating, cooking, and living her life. In fact, she ended up getting so busy traveling and enjoying herself again that we eventually lost touch, which honestly is one of my favorite outcomes because this is the kind of case that highlights the real issue. The data was there the entire time. It just wasn't being interpreted in a way that matched what was actually happening in her body. Another thing I see that we know about is that methane cutoffs are too high. Most labs use the cutoff of 10 parts per million to call a test positive. So if methane stays below that, it's typically flagged as a negative result. But clinically, we see symptoms, especially constipation, starting much lower, often around 3 parts per million and above. And some labs even note this nuance in their reports. And this is where interpretation really matters. You might remember the example we looked at earlier where methane didn't rise until the third hour, which alone could be missed on a 2-hour test. But looking back on that graph once again, you can see in the same example, methane never did rise above 10 parts per million. So despite a clear pattern, it could have still been labeled as negative by standard lab criteria. And yet this is exactly what we see so often in methane-driven cases. So in that graph, remember, we didn't see a rise until the third hour. And then at 150 minutes, methane got up to 7. At 180 minutes, it got up to 8. So that still was not above 10, but this patient had all the symptoms. And so we know that those levels up around 7 and 8 are truly meaningful enough to contribute to those symptoms. And in fact, the patient found relief once we addressed the overgrowth. And some labs do try to account for this nuance. You can see in this graph, you may notice the methane box is highlighted a little differently. And in the full report, the interpretation notes often mention that lower levels can still be clinically relevant in constipation cases. But even with that, many providers are still relying on the above 10 parts per million cutoff and would read this as normal, leading to that oh so familiar, your test was negative conversation. And patients often never see the full picture. Most people are just told one word, negative. Your test result was negative. They're not shown the baseline levels, the progression over time, the overall pattern. So they miss everything that actually matters. And that's where a lot of this gets lost. Even in the examples we've walked through, the data told a very different story from the final label. One client I worked with, who we will call Linda, came to me after getting her breath tests results back and feeling confused because during our initial conversation, she told me I had some methane, it wasn't very high. It was only 11, which if you're just going to go off the cutoff of 10, that really didn't sound like a very high elevation. And that's exactly how she was interpreting it and how I was interpreting it as she was telling me. And this is why I always want to see the full test results because what's in the summary box is often only a small piece of what's actually going on. When I looked at the summary box on her report, it was easy to see how she came to that conclusion because it listed her methane as 11, her hydrogen as normal, and the combined result as normal. So, of course, she thought this was just a slight elevation. When I reviewed the actual methane readings, it told a completely different story. Her levels were 76. These are per parts per million, 76, 81, 78, 71, 82, and then up to 87. A very high sustained methane pattern the entire time. And if you look at this graph, you can see how consistently elevated her methane readings were throughout the test. And that's something that's completely missed if you only look at the summary box. And what made this one especially confusing is that this was a different lab from some of the other examples we've shown you. And in their summary box, it wasn't showing her actual methane levels. It was showing an increase of 11 parts per million, which I decided was likely calculated between two of the other values. So instead of highlighting the fact that her methane was massively elevated throughout the test, the way the report summarized it completely distracted from what actually mattered. She wasn't wrong. She was just reading exactly what the report was telling her. And this is what I mean when I say patients don't see the full picture because the data is technically there, but the way it's presented makes it incredibly easy to miss. When I explained it to her, she was like, oh my God, no one has ever broken this down for me like this. And that moment is everything because for the first time, her symptoms actually made sense because interpretation matters just as much as the data itself. Two people can look at the exact same test and come to completely different conclusions depending on what they're actually paying attention to. This is why understanding these patterns, not just the final result, is so important. And another thing is that what happens in the last hour still matters. So, elevated fermentation later in the test is normal, but clinically it's not always looking normal. I'll explain what I mean. When gas levels rise in the last portion of the test, it's often written off as normal large intestinal fermentation. And to a certain extent, that's true. We do expect some fermentation once the substrate reaches the colon. In practice, some patterns go well beyond what we would typically expect. You may see levels climb much higher or more aggressively in that final hour, which can suggest that something else is going on beyond normal digestion or normal fermentation. So in this graph, hydrogen remains relatively moderate early on, then spikes significantly in the final hour. And while this portion of the test is often dismissed as normal large intestinal fermentation, patterns like this, especially when levels rise this sharply, can point to a broader imbalance that's likely still relevant clinically. In this graph, for those of you who are just listening, the numbers, now it is a positive for SIBO because the hydrogen does rise 43 parts per million between the baseline reading and the 90-minute reading. But then you'll see at 120 minutes, it's 50. At 150 minutes, it skyrockets up to 149. So that's what I'm talking about. Now, you might notice in this graph, the final reading wasn't captured. That just can sometimes happen in real world testing and doesn't change the overall pattern. In my experience working with clients, this kind of pattern often shows up alongside small intestinal overgrowth, which we see here in this example. It does not necessarily mean that everything is happening in the small intestine, and it can point to a broader imbalance in how fermentation is occurring throughout the entire gut, including the large intestine. And it is something we take into account when interpreting the full picture clinically. Even if that fermentation is happening later in the test, it doesn't make it irrelevant. Patterns like this are often associated with symptoms like bloating, discomfort, and changes in bowel habits. In some cases, like the example above, this pattern clearly meets the criteria for SIBO, but in other cases, you may see a similar late rise that doesn't technically meet the cutoff for SIBO test. Either way, it can still help explain why someone feels the way that they do, especially when everything is being labeled as normal. And in a functional nutrition practice like ours at Nutrition Resolution, this is something we would address because it can absolutely be a meaningful driver of symptoms even outside of a normal SIBO diagnosis. Next, transit time can distort test results. Slow transit can hide what's actually happening. And this is one of the most overlooked factors in SIBO testing. And that's how quickly or slowly things are moving through your digestive tract. Breath tests assume that the substrate is moving through the small intestine at a fairly predictable pace, but that's not always the case. When transit is slow, the solution may not travel far enough during the testing window to fully interact with microbes further along in the small intestine. As a result, gas production can appear minimal or delayed even when an overgrowth is present. This is one of the reasons you may see what's called a flatline pattern, where hydrogen and methane levels stay low or barely change throughout the test. Normally, we would expect to see gas levels rise later in the test, especially in the third hour, as the solution reaches the large intestine and feeds the bacteria that naturally live there. On paper, a flatline often gets labeled as normal because in the right clinical context, it can actually point to underdetection rather than the absence of an issue. We'll break this down more in a later section, but slow motility is one of the factors that can contribute to this type of pattern. At the same time, flatline patterns are not always about slow transit. In practice, we think about other possibilities like hydrogen sulfide, which we'll walk through shortly. And this is why looking at the full clinical picture matters, because a flatline pattern on its own doesn't tell the whole story. And the surrounding symptoms help point us toward what's actually driving it. The other way it can go is fast transit, and fast transit can make results look positive when they're not. So, just like slow transit can hide what's happening, fast transit can distort the test in the opposite direction. If a solution moves too quickly through the small intestine, it can reach the large intestine earlier than expected. When that happens, you can see an early rise in gas levels that looks like small intestine fermentation when it's actually coming from the large intestine. On paper, this can meet the criteria for a positive SIBO test, even though it's not reflecting overgrowth in the small intestine. And this is one of the reasons timing alone doesn't tell the full story. An early rise isn't always SIBO. Sometimes it's just the substrate moving faster than expected and feeding bacteria further downstream. And this is where clinical context becomes essential. Look at the symptoms, the patterns, and the full test timeline to help determine whether the early rise is truly coming from the small intestine or not. And in our practice at Nutrition Resolution, we often look at transit time more directly too to help us interpret the test if there's a question. That sometimes literally means having somebody eat something that will visibly show up in their poop and time it so we can see how long it's taking to move through. It's not glamorous, but it's incredibly telling. In that way, we can interpret whether their transit time is normal, whether it's fast, or whether it's slow. Because once you understand how fast or slow things are actually moving, it can completely change how you interpret what you're seeing on the test. At this point, we've looked at a lot of patterns or talked through a lot of patterns that can be missed or misinterpreted. But in order to really understand what's abnormal, you have to know what normal actually looks like. So let's talk about that for a second. On a typical normal breath test, hydrogen levels stay low throughout the small intestine. Then, once the solution reaches the large intestine, usually in the third hour, you'll see a rise as the bacteria that naturally live there begin to ferment it. So in this graph, this is a normal test from a patient of mine who was diarrhea predominant. You will see that the hydrogen stays low early on and then rises later in the test, which is exactly what we expect to see when fermentation is happening in the right place. And I mentioned that they're diarrhea predominant because in this case, the methane did get up to 6, but with a diarrhea predominant picture, that's normal because it's below, because in that case, we do go by the cutoff of below 10. So this is what a normal pattern generally looks like. Low gas levels early with fermentation happening later once the substrate reaches the large intestine. When the pattern looks like this and it aligns with the diarrhea presentation, it doesn't point to us towards SIBO as the driver. It tells us we need to zoom out and look elsewhere for the causes of this person's diarrhea rather than trying to force an overgrowth explanation where it doesn't fit. Let's return to this conversation about flatline patterns because I told you we would tease this out a little bit more. Now, a flatline pattern is exactly what it sounds like. It's little to no rise in hydrogen or methane across the entire test, and it's low numbers. So on paper, this often gets labeled as normal because nothing crosses the typical lab threshold to flag a positive. And so before we go further, let's just regroup on what the test is actually measuring. So most 2 to 3 hour breath tests only measure two gases, hydrogen and methane. They are not directly measuring the third type of SIBO, hydrogen sulfide, which means there are scenarios where hydrogen is being produced through fermentation, particularly later in the test as the substrate reaches the large intestine. But instead of accumulating and showing up, it's being used to produce hydrogen sulfide and therefore doesn't show up as elevated hydrogen. So let's just assume transit time is normal for a moment, because in our previous mention of flatline, we were talking about how that can show up with a slow transit time. So maybe in a 3 hour period, the solution never even got to the small intestine and there's no SIBO, so we see a flatline. Let's assume that scenario is put aside. Let's assume normal transit. We would normally expect to see gas levels rise later in the test, especially in the third hour as the solution reaches the large intestine and feeds the bacteria that normally live there. If that rise doesn't happen, it tells us something is interfering with what we would normally expect to see. And this is where hydrogen sulfide comes in. In these cases, hydrogen is still being produced, but certain bacteria are actually using the hydrogen to produce hydrogen sulfide instead. So instead of seeing hydrogen rise on the test, it stays flat, not because nothing is happening, but because the hydrogen is essentially being used up before it can show up on the test results. So notice in this graph that hydrogen is 5 or below throughout the entire test, even in the third hour, when we would usually see some increase due to the normal large intestinal fermentation. And this is why flatline patterns can be so misleading. This is not normal. Normally, we see fermentation. We know there's bacteria in the large intestine where your microbiome is housed. So something's off here, and it can be a bit misleading because both slow motility and hydrogen sulfide can result in a test being labeled negative, even when symptoms are significant. And this is where the symptom picture becomes essential. If someone has a clear sign of slowed motility like long-standing constipation or known motility issues, that can point more toward transit playing a role. Now, we do see constipation show up with hydrogen sulfide all the time. And that's something to clarify that we see that clinically, because in a lot of the research, hydrogen sulfide is associated with diarrhea, but clinically, we see a lot of constipation with it. So just because someone has constipation and you see the flat line does not mean it's necessarily a slow motility. So we have to look at other factors. When I've seen it not be hydrogen sulfide, first of all, I'll say clinically, I've seen that less often, where it's due to motility and not hydrogen sulfide. And number two, there's usually seems to be a deeper motility issue. So maybe something like a dyssynergia, pelvic floor issues, or a documented motility disorder. So keeping that in mind, we also look at the other symptoms to give us clues. So we're also looking at things like, does the person have sensitivity to sulfur containing foods like eggs, garlic, onions, cruciferous vegetables? Do they have an increasing in bloating or discomfort with those foods? Do they also have body aches, fatigue, just that toxic feeling? I will say with hydrogen sulfide, people just feel horrible. They just feel very, very sick. So those are some of the indicators. Now, you don't have to have everything on the list, but those are clues to help you piece the picture together. And in some cases, using a 3-gas breath test that measures hydrogen sulfide directly can help clarify this. But even then, we want to take interpretation in the context of the clinical picture. So the bottom line here is a flat line does not mean normal. It means you have to look deeper. Improper prep is another factor that can influence breath test results. For a breath test, there's a preparation procedure that's involved. Before a SIBO test, there's typically a specific restricted diet the day before with very specific foods you can eat and a lot of things you cannot eat, followed by an overnight fast. And it's designed to minimize any leftover fermentation from previous meals and previous days. If that prep isn't followed closely, it can affect the starting point of the test. Instead of being at a low baseline, gas levels may already be elevated before the test even really begins. And when that happens, one pattern we may see is a high baseline that gradually comes down with repeated readings and often pretty sharply. So rather than staying elevated, levels start high and then decrease as the test progresses, sometimes followed by a later rise once the substrate starts moving along and may or may not be detecting more fermentation. And honestly, I've shown you guys a lot of graphs today. I went digging through our files to find a clean example of this to show you, and I can't even find one. So that's how thorough I guess we are, thankfully, in our practice when it comes to walking patients through test prep and how to do it properly. But imagine a graph where the hydrogen starts elevated and then steadily comes down. That's often a sign that something during the prep phase may have interfered with the results. And that pattern looks very different from what we see with a true overgrowth. In methane dominant cases, for example, levels tend to stay elevated, so they'll start high and they'll stay elevated and consistent across the entire test, not drop off after the first reading. And we can also see hydrogen act that way, where it starts high and it's consistent. So that's not the same thing as improper test, where we see a high baseline that then drops afterward. And that distinction matters more than people realize, because a high baseline on its own can be misleading. And without looking at how the pattern evolves over time, it's easy to misinterpret what's actually going on. And this is why we always look at the full trend, not just the starting number. Helps us prevent misinterpretation in both directions, avoiding both false positives from poor prep and a missed pattern that can actually reflect overgrowth. Now, there are also alternative interpretation approaches in clinical nuance. And up to this point, we've been talking about standard interpretation rules, things like 20 parts per million rise in hydrogen or methane above a 10 parts per million threshold. But in practice, those aren't the only ways clinicians evaluate these tests. There are alternative approaches that take a more nuanced view of what's clinically meaningful. And one example that comes to mind is from that I learned from Dr. Alison Seebecker, who has proposed looking at the combined total of hydrogen and methane rather than evaluating each gas in isolation. And this isn't even math you have to do in your head necessarily. A lot of labs show you the combined score. So in this approach, the combination of hydrogen and methane, if it's above 15 parts per million or more within the first 120 minutes, that can be considered clinically significant, even if it doesn't meet the traditional criteria for a positive SIBO diagnosis. And that doesn't necessarily mean it would be labeled as SIBO from a conventional or diagnostic standpoint. But from a functional perspective, it can still represent an overgrowth pattern that's contributing to symptoms and worth paying attention to. And in our work at Nutrition Resolution, this is exactly the type of nuance we look at. If the pattern is there and it aligns with what someone is experiencing, we don't ignore it just because it doesn't mix a strict cutoff. We take it into account and we build a plan to help rebalance the gut environment and move things in a better direction. And the bigger takeaway with all this is that strict criteria are helpful, but they're not the only way to interpret test results. The pattern, the timing, and the person sitting in front of you matter just as much. This does not replace a formal diagnosis, but it does help us understand what may be contributing to symptoms and a way to move forward. We love testing, but only when it's used in the context of stepping back, zooming out, and looking at the whole person, not just treating the test in isolation. All of this matters more than most people realize because these interpretation gaps don't just stay on paper, they affect real people. When a test gets labeled negative, the conversation often stops there. Patients are told everything looks normal, even when their symptoms clearly say otherwise. They hear things like, your colonoscopy was normal, there's no cancer, congratulations, or it's just IBS. I guess you'll have to learn to deal with it, or here's some Miralax to manage your symptoms, or it's probably just stress. And while those statements aren't necessarily wrong, they often don't explain why someone is feeling the way that they are. So people are left trying to figure things out on their own, or worse, starting to question whether their experience is even valid. And in many cases, the underlying issue is still there. It just wasn't captured or interpreted in a way that reflects what's actually going on. So symptoms persist, and people stay stuck in that cycle of trying things, not getting answers, and feeling like they're missing something. This is something we see all the time, and that's why I'm talking about it today. People come to us after being told their test was normal, but when we take a closer look at the full pattern, their symptoms, the bigger picture, it becomes clear that there was more going on than what was initially picked up on and interpreted. And that's why understanding these patterns matters, because a negative result doesn't always mean nothing is there. It might just mean it wasn't interpreted in the right context. You may have heard that SIBO breath tests are not accurate. And in many cases, that perception comes from experiences like the ones we've walked through here. It's not so much that the test itself is inherently flawed, it's that there are a lot of nuances in how these results need to be interpreted. When those nuances are missed, it can lead to confusion, conflicting opinions, or results that don't seem to match how somebody feels. So, if you've been told your test was normal, but your symptoms don't line up, this is exactly the kind of situation we help people work through. You can schedule a strategy call with me personally. We'll link to that in the show notes where you can schedule that. And in that call, we'll talk through what's going on. I can review your test results with you as part of that conversation, and we can outline what a plan of working together could look like. So, SIBO breath tests can be incredibly useful, but their value comes down to how they're interpreted. They give us detailed data, and when you know how to read the full pattern in context, that data can be incredibly informative. A negative result doesn't automatically mean there's no overgrowth or imbalance. As you've seen throughout this episode, there are a number of ways these tests can miss or misrepresent what's actually happening. And this is why we don't look at tests in isolation. We look at the full picture, the patterns within your data, your symptoms, your history, and how everything connects. Because when you move beyond just treating what's flagged on a report and start addressing the underlying patterns and root drivers, you're no longer stuck guessing. You're working with a clear understanding of what's going on. And that's often when people finally start making real, lasting progress. So if you've been feeling stuck or like your results don't fully explain what you're experiencing, this is exactly the kind of work we help people with every single day. You can learn more or schedule a strategy call here to take the next step.